In the military, there's a place that never appears on maps and is never mentioned in briefings. Yet every service member knows it well. A forgotten corner called the smoke pit where uniforms are loosened, ranks are ignored, and stories surface that would never survive daylight or official reports. Because the smoke pit is not about nicotine or boredom, but confession. A space where the weight of war slips from the shoulders long enough for truth to breathe. And it is here that men and women speak about things they cannot explain, moments that refuse to fit inside logic or training manuals, experiences so unsettling that even the person who lived through them doubts their own memory. Yet the need to speak becomes stronger than the fear of being mocked, because silence after certain encounters feels heavier than gunfire. And as laughter fades and voices drop low, the stories begin. Tales of empty hallways that never feel empty, of footsteps pacing just out of sight, of voices whispering names that no one present spoke. And these are not campfire fantasies told by recruits, but accounts shared by combat veterans, spouses, medics, and military police, people trained to observe, to verify, and to remain calm under pressure, yet shaken by something that does not bleed, does not cast a shadow, and does not obey orders, and across bases scattered through deserts, forests, and foreign countries. A pattern quietly repeats itself, because the most haunted places are often those where something terrible happened, where life was taken suddenly, violently, or in despair, and the ground itself seems to remember, absorbing fear like spilled fuel. And in the military, such places are not rare, for war leaves behind more than wreckage and metals. It leaves echoes, and many who gather at the smoke pit admit they never planned to tell their story. Not tonight, not ever, but the words push forward anyway, driven by sleepless nights and the feeling of being watched when alone. And some admit they fear being labeled weak or unstable, yet others nod in recognition because they have felt it too. That sudden chill in a familiar room, that pressure in the chest with no physical cause, that certainty that someone is standing behind you when the room is empty. And what binds these stories together is not belief in ghosts, but shared uncertainty. The realization that despite all the training and technology, there are experiences the military cannot classify. And when fear grows too heavy and reason fails, there remains one last door to knock upon. The base chaplain, called not for sermons but for survival. Because when something follows you home, when your children speak to empty corners, when lights flicker and doors open on their own, faith becomes less about religion and more about hope. And among all the locations whispered about in smoke pits across the world, one name surfaces again and again. Spoken with a mix of dread and dark humor, a place Marines claim tests not only endurance but sanity. An isolated desert base where the heat crushes the spirit and the nights stretch endlessly. A place known as 29 Palms, where the land itself seems to watch those who arrive, and where the stories waiting to be told begin not with gunfire, but with silence. This silence is the kind that settles after trauma, thick and patient, listening as much as it is felt. And many swear that once you notice it, you cannot unfeel it, because it follows you from training fields to family housing, from deployment zones to quiet kitchens at 3 in the morning. And the smoke pit becomes the only place where admitting fear does not feel like failure, where shaking hands can still hold a cigarette and no one asks why. And some stories end with nervous laughter while others trail off unfinished, because even words seem afraid to go further. Yet every listener understands that these confessions are not entertainment, but warnings, reminders that some bases carry memories older than their current units, and that war does not always announce itself with explosions. Sometimes it waits, unseen, breathing in darkness, until someone is to speak. The Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Center at 29 Palms rises out of the Southern California desert like a punishment mistaken for a duty station. A vast, isolated sprawl of concrete, sand, and sky where the sun feels close enough to burn thoughts out of your head, and the nights stretch so wide and empty they seem to swallow sound itself. And Marines joke that the base exists only to test how much loneliness a person can endure. Yet beneath the dark humor lies something far more unsettling. Because 29 Palms is not just harsh, it is watchful. And those who live there often say the desert feels alive, as if it notices every footstep and remembers every scream ever swallowed by its sands. And among the many stories whispered at smoke pits, one stands out because it did not happen to a Marine in the field, but to a family trying to sleep. A Marine Corps spouse who found herself living in base housing with her husband, children, nieces, and an unborn child, believing the worst challenge. Ahead would be heat and isolation, not the house itself. And 3 weeks after moving in, at around 3 in the morning, she woke with the familiar discomfort of pregnancy and went to the bathroom, only to hear a man's voice speak clearly behind her, telling her to get out. Not a whisper, not a dream, but a firm, unmistakable command that froze her blood. And when she tried to rationalize it as exhaustion, the voice returned, louder and angrier, driving her back to the bedroom where she accused her sleeping husband of scaring her, only to find him completely unaware. And though fear lingered, she forced herself back to sleep, believing reason would protect her. But reason failed 15 minutes later when one of her young nieces suddenly screamed in terror, claiming her hair was moving on its own. And when she looked down, she saw the child's pigtail lifting into the air as if pulled by invisible fingers. An instinct overrode logic as she grabbed the children and ran barefoot into the desert night to a neighbor's house, heart pounding with the certainty that something inside her home did not want them there. And though embarrassment tried to follow fear, it could not explain what happened next, because the following evening the neighbor woke her to show her something impossible. The lights in her empty house flickering on and off as if someone were pacing through the rooms. And with her husband at work and fear tightening its grip, she went to the base chaplain, feeling foolish yet desperate. And the house was blessed, prayers spoken into corners heavy with unseen presence. And for a short while the fear eased, until a week later the chaplain called with information that shattered any remaining doubt, revealing that years earlier a soldier who had returned home from Vietnam had taken his own life inside that very house, his despair sealing itself into the walls like a stain that never faded. And suddenly the voice, the floating hair, the flickering lights were no longer isolated events, but symptoms of something unfinished. And stories like hers are not rare at 29 Palms, where Marines report shadowy figures moving between training ranges at night, shapes that vanish when headlights sweep across them, and others speak of hearing footsteps pacing outside their tents in the open desert where no one else could possibly be standing. And some claim to see figures watching from ridgelines long after all units have been accounted for, because the desert does not forget. It absorbs trauma and reflects it back in ways no one can predict, and isolation magnifies fear until it feels personal, intentional, as if the land itself is testing those who occupy it. And for families stationed there, the danger is not bullets or bombs, but the slow erosion of comfort, the sense that even home is not safe. And when children begin to speak to empty rooms, or spouses wake to voices calling their names, the joke about 29 Palms stops being funny, because some places do not need war to be haunted. They only need pain, time, and silence. And in that desert, silence is endless. Joint Base Lewis, McCord sits beneath a ceiling of constant gray, where rain soaks the ground until the earth itself seems exhausted. And hidden within this damp, forested installation stands a building that time has repeatedly tried and failed to erase, a structure now known as the Army Museum. Yet long before it held artifacts behind glass, it held living soldiers seeking escape from war, boredom, and loneliness. Because when it was first constructed, just after World War I, the building was called Green Park, a massive recreation complex designed to keep troops away from the vices that thrived outside the base gates. Filled with theaters, arcades, barbershops, restaurants, and a large hotel known as the Red Shield Inn, a place meant to preserve morale and sanity. Yet over time the laughter faded, the crowds vanished, and the building began to feel hollow, as if it had outlived its purpose. And during the late 1920s, when a patriotic silent film reenacting World War I was being produced on the base, the Green Park Hotel briefly returned to life. housing cast and crew who filled its halls with activity once more. But during that production, something went terribly wrong, because a man working on the film was murdered in a second-floor room. His death poorly documented and slowly buried beneath decades of renovations and reassignment. Yet the building remembered, and soon after, maids and hotel staff began reporting sightings of a strange figure wandering the halls late. At night, a man often described as wearing a cowboy hat, moving slowly, his presence heavy with sadness or anger. And while the description puzzled many, later researchers suggested the figure may have been a World War I soldier wearing a campaign hat, mistaken by modern eyes unfamiliar with older uniforms. And regardless of what he wore, the sightings continued, accompanied by unexplained noises, alarms triggering without cause, and a cold that seemed to settle into specific rooms like a living thing. And though much of Green Park was eventually torn down, the hotel portion survived, repurposed again and again, first as a guest house for soldiers and their families. Then finally, in the early 1970s, as a museum after asbestos concerns rendered it uninhabitable for lodging. Yet even stripped of beds and personal belongings, the disturbances did not stop. And by the 1980s, the situation had grown so unsettling that, according to reports published in base newspapers, religious officials were called in to address what many believed was a haunting. And it was said that 3 priests entered the building, prayed in the weapons part, and then ascended to the second floor where the murder had taken place, performing rites meant to release the trapped spirit. And afterward, they reportedly claimed the man appeared to them, expressing deep regret and anger at himself for causing his own death. And when told he was forgiven and free to go, he wept before fading away. Yet, whether this exorcism truly occurred remains unclear, because official church records do not confirm it, and later museum directors could find no documentation of either the murder or the ritual, raising the possibility that the event was carried out quietly by military chaplains to avoid publicity. But what cannot be denied is that the strange activity never fully ended, because even after the building became a museum, staff and visitors continued to report footsteps on empty floors, equipment malfunctioning without explanation, and a heavy oppressive feeling concentrated on the second floor. And in 1999, this reputation followed the building into the night shifts of military police, who were repeatedly dispatched to investigate alarms that revealed no intruders, locked doors, and silent halls. Yet those who stood near the building's outer gates often reported sudden chills, pressure in the chest, and an overwhelming sense of being watched, sensations so intense that seasoned officers admitted fear. And one officer later returned with his girlfriend, who initially doubted the stories, only to experience the same crushing dread and flee after seeing what appeared to be a human silhouette standing in one of the upper windows, watching them leave. And decades after its construction, long after the wars it was meant to serve had ended, the building remained active in a way no museum should be, as if the walls themselves refused to let go of what they had witnessed, proving that some structures do not simply house history, they become part of it. And at Joint Base Lewis McChord, that building still stands quiet, official, and very much awake. By the late 1990s, the Army Museum at Joint Base Lewis McChord had already earned a quiet reputation among soldiers and staff, but for the military police assigned to night duty, it became something more than just an old building with stories. Because in 1999, a series of alarm activations turned routine patrol into a recurring nightmare, beginning on a cold night when 2 MPs, one of them a man named John, received a call that the museum's burglar alarm had been triggered. And as trained responders, they rushed to the scene expecting either a break-in or faulty wiring. Yet what they found was nothing. Locked doors, intact windows, and empty halls that echoed only with their own footsteps. And after clearing the building, they returned to the station believing the incident resolved, only for the alarm to sound again minutes later, drawing them back into the darkness. And once again, there were no signs of forced entry, no movement, no explanation. And while such malfunctions could be dismissed as rodents or old wiring, the repetition planted unease, because the alarms continued throughout the night as if something wanted attention without ever revealing itself. And a few nights later, John found himself assigned to patrol the museum's perimeter as a deterrent, walking slowly past the outer gates under dim lighting while the massive structure loomed above him. And it was there, without warning, that the atmosphere changed, as John described a sudden heaviness pressing down on his body, accompanied by intense physical chills that raised the hair on his arms. A sensation so overwhelming it felt less like fear and more like intrusion, as if he had stepped into something unseen but deeply hostile. And when he reported the experience, his desk sergeant did not laugh or dismiss it, instead telling him quietly that others had felt the same thing in that exact spot. That other MPs had mentioned lights flickering inside the museum when no alarms had been triggered, and no one was inside. And though they joked about it on the surface, the pattern was clear enough to unsettle even seasoned officers. And curiosity mixed with disbelief led John's girlfriend June to visit the site with him one night, determined to prove to herself that the fear was imagined. And at first, nothing seemed out of place as they parked near the gate and stepped out into the cold air. But as June approached the same area John had described, she felt it too, an overwhelming wave of dread, and cold so intense it made her chest tighten and her instincts screamed danger. And without hesitation, she turned and ran back to the car, terrified beyond reason. And as they drove away, she glanced back at the museum and swore she saw the outline of a human figure standing motionless in one of the top floor windows, watching them leave. And while skeptics might argue stress or suggestion, the consistency of these reports over decades makes dismissal difficult, because long before and long after John's patrol, others reported similar sensations, the same oppressive feeling concentrated near the second floor, the same disturbances that never escalated into violence but never fully stopped, as if the presence attached to the building preferred observation to confrontation. And what makes such encounters especially disturbing for military police is the loss of authority they imply, because MPs are trained to respond, to control situations, to confront threats directly. Yet here was something they could not challenge, could not detain, and could not even properly define. And the museum remained officially open, its halls filled with history during the day, while at night it returned to something older and more private. And years later, staff and visitors continued to report strange sounds, malfunctioning equipment, and an unshakable sense of being watched, especially when alone, and whether the rumored murder ever occurred, whether an exorcism ever took place, or whether the spirit of a man consumed by guilt still wanders the upper floor. One truth remained unchanged: the hauntings did not stop, and for those tasked with protecting the base, the museum became a reminder that not every threat wears a uniform or leaves evidence, and some shadows cannot be cleared by a flashlight or a firearm, because they are built into the walls themselves. Yokota Air Base sits on the western edge of Tokyo, surrounded by the constant movement of a living city. Yet inside its gates there are places where time feels frozen, where the air grows heavy and memories refuse to fade. And among the most infamous of these are the Tower Apartments, tall concrete buildings that once symbolized modern military living but later became associated with tragedy, fear, and whispered warnings passed quietly between residents. And the darkest story tied to these towers dates back to the late 1970s, when an Air Force technical sergeant returned home after a normal workday, expecting nothing more than routine domestic noise, only to walk into a scene so horrific it would permanently scar the base's collective memory. Because inside his apartment, he found the lifeless bodies of his 4-year-old son and a 3-year-old girl from a neighboring family, while his wife lay nearby with her wrists slashed, barely alive, and the shock of that moment rippled outward through the base like an explosion, because the little girl had been under his wife's care that day. And although she survived and was hospitalized, details surrounding the case remained disturbingly unclear, with rumors spreading faster than facts. Some claiming the children had been stabbed, others saying they were drowned in the bathtub. And while official records offered little closure, what many residents remembered most was the claim that the woman said she had been possessed and remembered nothing of what had happened. A statement that haunted Yokota long after the case faded from headlines. And from that point forward, the Tower Apartments developed a reputation that could not be scrubbed away, because over the years additional tragedies occurred, most notably people throwing themselves from balconies or rooftops, acts so frequent that access to the rooftops was eventually restricted. Yet residents claimed they could still hear voices late at night, sometimes sounding like a young man yelling in distress from above, even though no one could be seen. And children living in the towers began reporting strange encounters of their own, describing shadowy figures standing near bathroom doors, voices calling for help from empty rooms, and knocking sounds that came from nowhere. And while adults tried to explain these stories away as imagination or stress, the consistency across decades made denial difficult, because different families, arriving years apart with no knowledge of prior events, described nearly identical experiences, and some spoke of dark silhouettes appearing briefly in elevators, while others felt sudden coldness so intense it seemed to drain warmth from their bodies in seconds. And these encounters were not limited to the past, because even in the 2010s, residents continued to share stories online, connecting dots between personal experiences they had once been too embarrassed or afraid to voice. And many believe the energy tied to the original tragedy had never been released, instead spreading through the building like a sickness, feeding on fear, grief, and isolation. And in military life, isolation is already a constant companion, especially overseas, where language barriers, distance from extended family, and the pressure of service create emotional strain. And when that strain is combined with unexplained disturbances in what should be the safest place of all, home becomes something unfamiliar and threatening. And spouses, living alone during deployments, reported nights spent awake listening for footsteps that never appeared, while children refused to sleep without lights on, claiming they could see someone standing in the corner of their rooms. And what made these experiences especially disturbing was not just fear, but the sense of being observed, as if something unseen was aware of their presence and reacting to it. And whether one believes in spirits, psychological trauma, or some combination of both, the reality for those living in Yokosu's towers was the same. Fear felt real, persistent, and deeply personal. And for many families, the only comfort came from sharing their stories with others who understood. Because on that base, silence was never truly silent, and the tower stood tall against the Tokyo skyline, outwardly ordinary, inwardly carrying decades of pain that refused to stay buried. As the years passed, and new families rotated through Yokosu Air Base, many arrived unaware of the tower's history, believing rumors of hauntings were nothing more than exaggerated base folklore. Yet it rarely took long for doubt to creep in, because strange events began quietly and then escalated with unsettling confidence. And one such account came from an Air Force spouse who moved into a garden-style housing unit on the west side of the base in the early 2010s, initially dismissing the odd occurrences as stress or simple coincidence, until patterns formed that could no longer be ignored. Because sometimes a spare bedroom will be found completely stripped of its sheets and blankets overnight with no explanation. Other times, loud, crashing noises would erupt from the kitchen in the middle of the night, only for nothing to be broken or disturbed. And on several mornings, the family would wake to find every cabinet door wide open despite being closed the night before. And at first, suspicion fell on her husband, until his deployment left her alone with the house, and the activity continued unchanged, forcing her to confront the terrifying realization that something else was responsible. And fear was compounded by isolation, because military spouses overseas often hesitate to speak up, worried they will be dismissed as anxious or unstable. Yet when she began asking others on the base if they had experienced anything similar, she discovered she was far from alone, as multiple spouses and service members shared stories of unexplained lights turning on and off, persistent knocking sounds that came from inside walls, and a heavy sense of being watched, especially at night. And this shared fear eventually led to the creation of a private community where residents could speak openly without judgment, not to chase thrills, but to confirm they were not losing their minds. And around the same time, another airman and her husband reported activity so consistent it was captured on home security cameras, showing televisions powering on by themselves and bedroom lights flickering while the house was empty. And though footage alone could not explain intent, it validated the emotional impact, because fear grows stronger when evidence exists but answers do not. And as anxiety spread, more residents turned to the base chaplain, not necessarily because they believed in demons or ghosts, but because they needed peace, and chaplain-led home cleansings became an informal response to the growing number of reports, offered quietly and without official sanction, focusing as much on emotional relief as spiritual reassurance. Yet those who participated often described a tangible shift afterward, as if something heavy had been lifted from the air, and the chaplain himself admitted that while not every case involved literal spirits, some homes carried a darkness that could not be explained by stress alone, describing moments where his skin tingled and an instinctive sense of danger filled the room, reactions he had felt only during previous traumatic experiences. And families who invited him into their homes often did so out of desperation rather than belief, including one couple whose young daughter had begun experiencing sleep regression, waking at night, screaming about monsters, and pointing toward empty corners of her room, and the parents, exhausted and frightened, reported seeing unexplained orbs of light on the baby monitor in white, streaks moving through their bedroom at night. And those skeptical of religion, they agreed to a cleansing in hopes of restoring comfort before welcoming a new baby into the home. And afterward, the mother described a noticeable sense of calm returning, not a sudden end to every disturbance, but a feeling that the house was no longer hostile. And what stood out most in these accounts was not terror, but relief. Because the greatest fear for many families was not the idea of spirits, but the isolation of being alone with something they could not explain. And whether the cause was psychological trauma passed through stories, residual energy from decades of tragedy, or something far more literal, the effect on those living there was real, and Yokota's leadership did not officially acknowledge the hauntings. Yet the steady flow of chaplain visits told its own story, because requests increased dramatically compared to previous assignments, suggesting the base itself carried a unique weight. And for those who live there, belief became secondary to experience, because when your child cries out at night for someone you cannot see, when doors open on their own and silence feels crowded, the question is no longer whether ghosts exist, but how to keep fear from consuming your home. And in that struggle, faith, community, and shared stories became the only defense, proving that some battles are fought not with weapons, but with courage, understanding, and the willingness to admit that not everything can be explained away. Long after individual stories faded and families rotated out of Yokota Air Base, the sense that something unseen lingered never truly disappeared. Because what made Yokota different from other military installations was not just one tragic event or one haunted building, but a pattern that stretched across decades, units, and locations, forming an invisible thread that connected people who had never met yet shared the same fear, the same sensations, and the same quiet dread. And this pattern became most evident among night workers, security forces, and maintenance crews who spent their shifts moving through empty corridors, dark stairwells, and silent housing areas while the rest of the base slept, because again and again these individuals reported footsteps following them at a distance, doors unlocking themselves moments after being secured, and the overwhelming feeling that they were being observed by something just out of sight. And unlike rumors passed between families, these accounts came from trained professionals accustomed to high-stress environments, people who knew the difference between imagination and instinct. Yet many admitted that Yokota was the only assignment where fear followed them home. And one senior non-commissioned officer recalled patrolling near the older housing towers late at night, when he heard what sounded like a man sobbing softly from an upper floor. A sound so real and human that he immediately called it in as a possible domestic emergency, only for responders to find the entire building empty and locked down, with no residents assigned to that section. And after that night, he avoided that area whenever possible, not out of superstition, but because his body reacted with uncontrollable anxiety every time he approached it. And similar reactions were reported by base firefighters responding to automatic alarms that led nowhere. describing sudden drops in temperature inside buildings and the feeling of pressure on their chest that vanished the moment they stepped back outside. And even visiting contractors, unaware of the base's reputation, occasionally commented on an unsettling atmosphere, asking half-jokingly if the place was haunted, unaware how close their guess was to the truth. And what made these experiences more disturbing was how often children seemed to notice things adults could not. Because across multiple generations, kids described seeing the same types of figures: dark shapes standing in doorways, pale faces near windows, and people who disappeared when approached. Descriptions given before parents ever mentioned ghost stories or local history. And psychologists might argue that stress, cultural suggestion, and isolation play powerful roles, especially in overseas military communities. Yet that explanation struggles when the same details emerge from families separated by years and geography. And even skeptics who arrived determined to dismiss the stories often left Yokota with at least one experience they could not explain: a sound, a shadow, or a moment of fear that lingered long after reassignment. And perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Yokota's reputation is that it does not rely on a single malevolent entity, but rather feels like an accumulation, as if decades of trauma, loss, and emotional strain have soaked into the base itself, creating an environment where strange things feel more possible. And military bases are, by nature, places of transition where people arrive, endure hardship, and leave, sometimes carrying scars that never heal. And Yokota, sitting between cultures and generations, seems to have absorbed those scars, reflecting them back in subtle and terrifying ways. And while leadership maintains an official stance of neutrality, neither confirming nor denying the stories, the quiet accommodations made over the years, restricted access areas, increased chaplain involvement, and reassignment requests quietly approved, suggest an unspoken understanding that something about the base affects people deeply. And for those who live there, the haunting was not always about fear, but about recognition, the realization that others had felt the same chill, heard the same sounds, and questioned their sanity in the same way. And that shared experience created a strange sense of solidarity, a reminder that they were not alone, even when alone. And as Yokota continues to operate, modernized and active, new families arrive with fresh optimism, unaware of the stories whispered after dark. Yet inevitably someone will hear footsteps in an empty hall, see a shadow where no one stands, or feel that unmistakable sensation of being watched. And when they do, they will join a long, unbroken line of witnesses stretching back decades, proving that while units deploy and buildings change, the unseen presence at Yokota remains silent, patient, and very much awake, making it a base that never truly sleeps.